All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with this session, so if you can take your seats. Welcome, everybody. This is covering climate change, a journalist's perspective, and I'm really excited about this particular panel here that's with me today because, by the way, my name is Steve Valk, and I'm the Communications Director for Citizens Climate Lobby, and, well, thank you. You're too kind. So one of the things that I do as the communications director is I manage our Twitter feed. And so in that role, I kind of function as a wire editor, as somebody who kind of scours the internet looking for the best climate change stories of the day to post on our Twitter feed. So, you know, we do the searching so that you don't have to. And a lot of the times the stories that I'm posting on our Twitter feed are written by the people that you see up here on the stage. We have a really wonderful group of folks. We have an editorial writer and 3 reporters up here with you today. So we're going to have a great conversation. We're going to get some insight into how climate change is being covered in the media. So let me go ahead and get started by introducing our panel. Over here on my left is Steve Stromberg. He's an editorial writer with the Washington Post. They have more than one. But Steve, he started out with the LA Times and joined the Post's editorial page in 2006. He spent 2007, 2008 with The Economist, where he covered presidential election and the Great Recession. Then he went back to the Post after that in 2009 to the opinion section and started writing about U.S. policy, politics, the White House, Congress. He covers a whole range of issues, including energy and the environment. So whenever you read an editorial in the Post about climate change, there's a pretty good chance that Steve's the guy who wrote it.
I've only written the ones that you like.
Right, exactly. He only writes the ones that you like. But not only that, when he does write about climate change, he seldom misses a chance to bring up the topic of a revenue neutral carbon tax. Yeah, definitely, yeah. So this is the guy who keeps plugging that for us. And the Post has been a strong and consistent advocate for effective carbon pricing. And of course, that's due in large part to Steve's presence on the editorial board. So next person I want to introduce is over on my far right is Amy Harder. She's a reporter for Axios, and she recently joined. It's an online news site. And so recently, in fact, that when I looked up her biography, it was still on the website of the Wall Street Journal, where she spent 3 years covering energy policy. And prior to the Wall Street Journal, she covered energy for the National Journal. And so she's over at Axios now, and she continues to cover energy policy. And her column on Axios is called The Harder Line. So check it out sometime. And if you're not familiar with Axios, it's a very different and interesting news platform designed to be easier for people who don't have a lot of time to kind of get a full briefing on what's going on in the world. So next on my immediate right here is Emily Atkin. She reports for science and environmental politics for the New Republic. So her byline has appeared in Newsweek, Slate, Mother Jones, the New York Observer, Daily Beast, The Hill, Think Progress, Sojourners Magazine. Am I leaving anything out here?
Good.
No, okay. So she has done video and radio reporting on Sinclair Broadcast Group and WAMC Northeast Public Radio. And she got her bachelor's in journalism and political science from State University of New York. So that's Emily. And last here we have Hannah Hess. Hannah is a climate reporter for E&E Daily News and Greenwire, covering federal resilience and adaptation strategies, greenhouse gas regulation from USA EPA, and she also covers what's going on Capitol Hill and the White House and so forth. So she got her master's in public affairs reporting from the University of Illinois in Springfield. And for those of you who don't know E&E News, it's not what you would call mainstream media. It's a very specialized news gathering organization. The subscription rates are extremely high. They have some stories that appear on a public page, but most of them are behind a paywall, and you would think, okay, well, who's going to pay tons of money for that kind of service? Well, just about all of the movers and shakers in the energy and environment field. We're talking about industry leaders, agencies, people like that, NGOs. Anybody who wants to know what's going on with energy and environment and keep track of it is subscribing to E&E News. And a lot of news organizations subscribe to E&E News because they have a tremendous amount of resources that are covering this issue. And so a lot of news organizations look to E&E News to find out, okay, what are the stories that we're missing right now? So with that, let me kind of go over what the format here is going to be for this afternoon. I'd like to start off things with a specific question for each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to a broader range of topics that anybody can respond to. And when there's about 20 minutes left, we will take questions from the audience. And the way that we're going to do this is I have my assistant Megan down here. She has index cards for you. So if during the first part of our session here you think, oh, I got a question, raise your hand and Megan will get you an index card. We have a certain amount, so we may run out, but raise your hand and Megan will give you a card and you can write your question down, and then you can raise your hand again when you're ready to give the card back to Megan. So she's going to let me know when we've got about 20 minutes left, so that I can shut up and start taking questions. By the way, are there any CCL staffers in the room right now? No? Okay, never mind. So let's go ahead and get started. As I said, we're going to start with asking each of our panelists a question that's specific to them. And this one's for Amy. I want to start off with her. So she wrote for the Wall Street Journal. You wrote for the Wall Street Journal for 3 years. Now that's one of the top 3 most prestigious newspapers in the country. So there's literally thousands of reporters out there who would give their left arm to be writing for the Wall Street Journal. And you walked away from that to write for Axios when you were hired. At the time, Axios was a relatively unknown online startup news platform. So with that little preamble, I have kind of a multi-part question. So what was it that attracted you to Axios? What can you do with them that you couldn't do at the Journal? And how will your coverage of climate change differ from other news outlets? What is it that you're aiming for? So go ahead, and you might have to pull the mic over toward you there. There you go.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Should I?
There you go.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here. I'm happy to be here. If I had a dime every time somebody asked me that question in the last few months, I would be a rich woman. Well, I just want to say that I loved my time at the Journal. It wasn't anything that was particularly bad at the Journal, but more just the allure of a new adventure at a new media company it was founded by the people who started Politico. And that was really intriguing to me just from a broad career perspective. You don't get very many opportunities to start something new like that. And so I thought I could stay doing what I was doing or try something new. And then more relevant to you guys here in the audience is I wanted to do more analytical, creative writing, and I found at the Journal that I wasn't able to do that quite as much. I was covering the waterfront of a very big beat, everything from climate change to oil exports to EPA, environmental issues. It was really everything. So I have my harder line column that I really enjoy doing. Today, my column is all about how the importance of the media covering climate change in an accurate but not loaded way. And so I encourage you all to read it if you haven't yet. And so to your second question about what I can do at Axios that I couldn't do at the Journal, I think it was that. I mean, I really like having an outlet where I can kind of cut through the noise and a lot of the BS and to tell readers what is actually going on. And I was able to do that at the Journal, of course, but in a more circumspect way, and also just to get to the point. I think a lot of times traditional media, no offense to my colleagues here, but I think sometimes we in the media, we have to we have grown up in these typical ways where you're supposed to give quotes to either side, and even if they're boring quotes, and we cut through all that at Axios. If it's an interesting quote, we'll include it, but if it's not, we're not going to. And then what was your last question?
Let's see.
Oh, about how we cover climate change differently.
Right.
Well, I think at Axios we cover pretty much everything in a little bit different way. What I do is I like to, cover it from any sort of interesting angle that maybe didn't get as much attention. We have a news desk of reporters who cover the waterfront of issues, and then I come in and I provide analysis right off the bat. So we have the spot story, but we also have analysis pretty instantaneously, and I think that's something that we hope our readers find to be interesting. Just one last point. I was remarking over lunch that I've covered more climate change in the last few months under Trump than I did for most of Obama's term. And that's in part for a couple of different reasons. One, because Obama didn't focus on climate change a lot of his first term. And then the second term, it was really just a regulatory push on climate change that made him butt heads with a lot of the fossil fuel industry. So that's what I was covering. But now I'm covering the conflict between the climate community, such as yourselves, and the Trump administration. And that's where the hot news is. And that's why I keep covering it, because that's where the issue is. And so it's just interesting to me as a reporter to notice kind of how I zig and zag and the topics I cover depending upon what the administration is prioritizing. And I say, as I say in my column, I think it's incredibly important that reporters emphasize the scientific consensus that climate change is real and a problem, which is something that the administration doesn't say. And I think it's important that we say that.
Thank you, Amy. And as Amy mentioned, she's got a really nice piece this morning. The headline on it is Trump's Climate Denial and the Power of Media. And if you want to look it up real quickly, just go to our Twitter feed. I tweeted her piece this morning. It's an excellent piece. And I think you'll like the way articles on Axios are kind of organized so that the information is accessible and digestible in a really quick manner. But let me move on to Steve over there. I was chatting with him just a minute ago, and I say, well, you're writing a lot about climate change lately. Well, not as much as he'd hoped, because there's so many other things going on right now that are they're kind of, I guess, sucking up the media oxygen, if you will. But anyway, Steve, as I mentioned, you've been beating the drum for a revenue-neutral carbon tax for about 4 or 5 years now, despite the fact that to this point there has been no support for such legislation among Republicans in Congress. There hasn't even been a bill introduced for a totally revenue-neutral carbon tax. And so in that regard, you and the Post are, and I say this with great appreciation, you and the Post are fulfilling your role as the fourth branch of government. That's the branch that lights a fire under the other branches when they fail to do their job, to do what's best for the nation. And our volunteers meet with editorial boards at their local newspapers, and some of those newspapers have endorsed our carbon fee and dividend proposal, but many of them haven't, because they're saying that we're not going to weigh in on a policy that hasn't been introduced as legislation. It's kind of a catch-22, though, because newspapers won't endorse a policy without a bill, but unless lawmakers get pressure from the papers back home, they have very little incentive to introduce and support legislation. So what I want to ask, Steve, as the guy who's sitting at the other side of the table in the editorial room there, what would your coaching be for our volunteers to convince newspapers to endorse this policy, even though a bill hasn't been introduced? You might have to move that over there. Okay.
Everybody hear me? Great. Thank you for your very kind introduction, first of all. Thank you for having me here. I guess I'd start by pointing out that you're right, we have been on a carbon tax crusade for quite a while now, and though we've said very nice things about the revenue neutral approach, we've also said nice things about all sorts of other carbon tax approaches too, which is to say we just really, really like the idea of carbon pricing. And you get into the reason for that, I think, is we like market-based solutions whenever possible. We tend to listen very closely to expert analysis and opinion, you do that on this particular issue, it inevitably, almost always, points into the direction of carbon pricing as the efficient solution or efficient response to the issue of global warming and emissions abatement. That's sort of a complicated way of saying I think the best advice I could give anybody is to sort of figure out what the editorial board you're pitching is about. For a long time we've been on record again on the carbon pricing question, and we've been again, we've been open to all sorts of different sort of variations on that theme, but the person you're talking to might not feel quite the same way, and so be familiar with what they've said in the past, be familiar with when they've decided to take a stance that might be ahead of local or federal legislators, and in what circumstances they've decided to do that. In our particular case, again, the policy is so elegant, the need for policy on this issue is so important that we've obviously felt very comfortable getting out ahead on this issue, ahead of where the politics seem to be. Though I would also point out that when you're talking about carbon pricing, it's not new in the sense that in 2008, you had two candidates who each of whom were proposing a carbon pricing scheme. And so it didn't seem particularly outside the mainstream, at least then. So I would suggest that, though the specific form of carbon fee and dividend, or carbon tax and dividend, revenue neutrality, these details might seem different. The underlying policy, I don't think should be treated as some kind of wacky, maybe in 20 years sort of idea. Mm-hmm. It's in fact been around for a long time and was treated as mainstream for a long time.
Right. So if you were in our shoes and we came in and told them about this wonderful solution, and they said, hey, it sounds great and all that, but is there a bill? Well, if there's no bill, what do we have to talk about? What would be your response to them?
Well, you've tapped into one of the major tensions in the editorial writing world, small as it is. This is one of them. When are you sort of affirmatively? When is it the right idea to sort of affirmatively get out there and advocate for a policy, even if it seems sort of hopeless, and when are you just sort of naive in doing so? Mm-hmm. And so there's this constant question of, well, we don't want to seem completely out of left field. On the other hand, when something is right, it's right. So, I think you have to appeal to the editorial writer's sense of, again, this is an important issue. We know the solution. We can take it off the shelf, and the editorial, at least in my experience, and I've really mostly wrote at the Post, the editorial writers who are in it for the, they're generally in it for the right reasons. That is, they don't get a byline, right? So they're doing it because they care about the issues, they care about the content, they care about the policy. And so if you're able to say, well, look, the policy is just that compelling, the policy is just that good, that it deserves the kind of affirmative advocacy that you would reserve for issues that are, and policies that are particularly great, then I think that's the way to get people who are motivated the way editorial writers often are and should be motivated.
That's great. So did you think organizations like the Climate Leadership Council, the conservative group, do you think them kind of coming on board with similar proposals will help kind of push the editorial writers a little bit more to say, okay, well, maybe we should be taking this a little bit more seriously now?
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, I'm coming up from a position of we were already there and already had been there for a long time before we heard from the CLC. But and we wrote a very nice thing about the CLC as well when they did that, came out with their fee and dividend proposal. It could help, to again, if there's some way to make the politics seem a little bit less impossible, that might help a little bit.
Yeah.
And also, I would point out, again, if good sort of fair-minded editorial writers are, they won't want to be sort of partisan either, and to the extent that. This shouldn't really matter, honestly, but to the extent that something doesn't seem like just sort of something that one
left wing or right wing,
that's associated with as a partisan issue. Of course, we take stances on partisan issues all the time, and again, the content and the merits should dictate where we go with it. It may be that could help marginally. And some editorial boards, more than we do, respond to kind of ideological appeals. We tend to not. So maybe some people who are working in that sort of situation would feel more compelled to give it a full, thorough, fair shot. But again, I think the argument just has to be, look, this is the clever policy. This is the elegant policy. This is the policy that should be bipartisan if you take kind of what each side says about what they believe seriously.
Right.
And that the editorial boards ideally would respond to a pitch that's fact-based, that's with expert analysis, expert reasoning. And again, as clever and as elegant as the policy is, it should speak for itself.
If you're looking at this honestly and objectively, this is what we need to do. Yeah, excellent, great, thank you for that. So let's turn to Hannah. You write for E&E News. This is an organization, as I said, that has an embarrassment of riches with a number of excellent reporters who write about climate change. So in your reporting, you talk to members of Congress from time to time, and you probably talk to congressional staff almost on a daily basis. And they are your sources. Sometimes they speak on the record. Sometimes they speak for background and no attribution. And then there's sometimes when they speak off the record. So I suspect, and many of us assume, that there are a lot of Republicans who accept the science of climate change and know that action is called for, and that the Republicans who are on the Climate Solutions Caucus are probably like the tip of the iceberg. So based on what you hear off the record, Is that an accurate assumption? And if so, what are they telling you about what it would take for them to come out of the closet?
It's a great way of phrasing it. Can everyone hear me okay? So first, thanks for the great plug for E&E News. Our team would be upset with me if I didn't mention that we do open up about 5 stories a day that go beyond our paywall. So if you're interested in our content, 5 of our 70 or 80 stories that we produce on a daily basis are free. I have been writing a lot about the Climate Solutions Caucus. I wasn't on the climate beat when the caucus was founded in early 2016?
Yeah, February 2016.
Yeah, so I haven't been covering climate on the federal level for that long, but I can tell you that our readers are very interested in this. Whenever I write a 4-paragraph story about this person joined, we've kind of we've dubbed it the Noah's Ark Caucus because, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, a Democrat has to bring on board a Republican. And I find myself writing a lot about the politics at play in that person's district, what kind of a race they're facing in 2018 when they choose to come out and join the Climate Caucus. And I would say, based on my conversations with staffers in the House and Senate on this issue, a lot of times when you talk to a new member who's joined this caucus, they don't necessarily have the most artful way of talking about climate, whether or not they think greenhouse gases are actually contributing to climate change, how serious of a problem they think it is, but they know that their constituents care. And that is the driving force.
That's the most important thing, yeah.
They love to talk about, there's a congressman from Nebraska, and his staff loves to talk about how in Omaha there was the Citizens Climate Lobby chapter there that threw him a party, basically, when he joined this caucus. And so, I mean, whether or not, how firm of a stance these members are actually going to take when it comes time to vote on these policies remains to be seen, and for that reason, a lot of Democrats on Capitol Hill are skeptical about the Climate Solutions Caucus, the more progressive members who aren't members. But the Republicans who are part of it are very quick to want to tell me about what they were hearing from back home and how important this is to their constituents back home, and how they've managed to carve out this narrow issue that's very bipartisan and proves that they're listening to what's happening in their district and not just, at this point, falling in line with what President Trump's doing.
Great. Thank you for that. So speaking of the Climate Solutions Caucus, we're going to turn to Emily here for a second. So you're a reporter for the New Republic, and the pieces that you write about go beyond just facts and quoting sources. You inject a lot of analysis into the things that you write about. You raise as many questions as you answer. And so from CCL's perspective, the last piece that you wrote was pretty brutal, but I think honest and fair. You looked at the Republicans on the Climate Solutions Caucus who supported Trump's decision to exit the Paris Agreement, and you posed these questions. If climate-minded Republicans in the Climate Solutions Caucus can't even agree on Paris, how can they agree on actual legislation? And if they can't agree, why does the caucus exist at all? So that was certainly knocked the rose-colored glasses off our faces a bit, and it was kind of a wake-up call to us that yes, clearly we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. So I'd like to let you talk a little bit about why you wrote the piece. I don't think you were being cynical. I think you raised legitimate concerns. And what do you need to see from the caucus before you'll get excited about what's going on there?
Hey. Awkward, right? Well, first of all, I would just say that it's not that I'm not excited or hopeful or don't think it's a good thing that there exists a caucus where congressional Republicans are at least coming out and acknowledging that climate change is real and an issue, because that's sort of unprecedented in the political situation that we live in. And I think I did acknowledge that in the piece, or I quoted other people who were saying, this is a big deal comparatively to where we are, and I acknowledge that. But what my job is, as a reporter for the New Republic, is to, you sort of touched on it a little bit, which is sort of to go beyond the facts of what's happening and try and analyze it and address it for a progressive audience, for an audience that wants to see solutions to today's most critical issues. That's what the New Republic is, and that's how it's been described for 100 years, which is it's a publication dedicated to addressing today's most critical issues. Climate change is a huge issue, and I'm not only trying to report on what's happening to address it, but why it's happening, and is it effective? Is it actually going to get us anywhere in addressing this and solving this issue? And so I wrote the story about the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus because it seemed to me the most novel thing happening in the climate space in terms of actually trying to get a solution. Because, I mean, with a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president who doesn't think climate change is real, you're not going to get a climate solution coming from the federal government unless you have some Republicans on board. So my question in approaching the caucus was, what are you doing? Like, what are you actually doing to find solutions other than just appeasing your, especially with the Republicans, other than just appeasing the people that you represent, who clearly think climate change is a problem? And that's sort of the question that I attempted to pose in the piece, which was, are they doing anything more than just saying, I think that climate change is real? And when the Paris Agreement, when we withdrew from the Paris Agreement, or when Trump said that we were going to, I just noticed that every single Republican, I started making actually like a Google spreadsheet of every single Republican and then tallying their responses and what they said about it. And the fact was that most of them said, some people said nothing, some people supported the decision, and then some people said, I think it was a bad decision, but the Paris Agreement wasn't a great agreement in the first place, and it was done unilaterally, and there just wasn't a unified response to that. And so yeah, I pointed that out, and I said, think about how it does a lot of good for Republicans on that caucus to be on that caucus for their constituents, but they have a lot to fear in our political situation. You'll note, I think most people have pointed out that there hasn't been a climate bill in Congress since 2010, which coincidentally is the same year as the Citizens United decision. And I think a lot of Republicans are still extremely fearful, even if they come out and they go on this Climate Solutions Caucus, that if they start actually pushing policy solutions, that's when the big funded clause are going to come out.
They'll get a target on their back, right?
Exactly. So that's why I wrote the piece, just to sort of let everyone know what was going on with that. And like I said before, it's not that I'm not excited about it or that I'm not impressed, but that I'm just trying to say that more needs to happen before it actually means anything.
And by the way, Emily did talk to me. She came to us and gave us the opportunity to give us our take on all of this. And as I said, I thought the article really raised some legitimate concerns. And so I encourage you to look it up. It'll be on the New Republic's website. If you look up, Emily Atkin on the New Republic, you'll see it on there. Was I think it was the last piece that got posted from me. Yeah. So it's like I say, it's a little tough, but I think it was honest. So I'm going to kind of open things up to some more broader questions for everybody. I just want to remind folks. So Megan, if you can just stand up, if there's anybody in here who wants to ask a question, Megan can give you a card and you can write some questions down. And while that's going on, we'll touch on some other topics here. So let's get into social media. So this is for everybody. How much do you interact with readers, say on Twitter, and if they point to sources that relate to your stories, do you actually check them out? What's the best way for readers to communicate with you and respond to the things that you're writing about? So we'll just kind of go down the line here. Amy, if you want to start in on that. Great.
Well, I certainly watch and see and usually, digest what people say to me on Twitter. I try not to have very long conversations on Twitter because that's is a waste of time. It's only 140 characters. I rather take it offline via email or on direct message if I also follow the other person. But I tend to respond more positively to emails than I do Twitter pitches or reactions, just because on Twitter it can often feel like it can just be a little bit more aggressive and pithy, where I think an email you can always just have a more thought out opinion or reaction. And my email is on my Twitter account, so whenever people asks me what my email is, I just remind them that it's right there, amy@axios.com, which is very easy to remember, I hope. And so it's something that I don't dismiss right off, but it's also something I won't ever be getting into Twitter fights with people. I don't believe in tweet storms. I think most people are not important enough to do tweet storms. I think too many people do them. Tweet storms is where you tweet 20 things on one topic, and unless you're Donald Trump, most people aren't going to be reading your tweet storms.
Great. Just before I get to that, I just want to say, so great way to communicate with you then is through email. How many emails do you get a day from readers, do you think?
Oh gosh, I don't know. It's actually, I would say, increased a bit since I've been at Axios, because I've been writing more thought-provoking pieces, as opposed to Obama issued X regulation, So I would say, in my column, maybe a dozen or so.
Daily?
Well, for one column, I'd probably get a dozen in the first day.
Whenever you post something, you get about a dozen responses. That's manageable. Okay.
Yeah. And most of the people reading my columns are really interested in the topic, so it's not. At the Journal, I will say that when I think the most reader responses I got were on things like the Gold King mine spill in Colorado that EPA was dealing with, and the Flint water crisis. And those are from people not as engaged in policy. And then, of course, on climate stories, I would get a lot of people who just thought climate change was a bunch of BS. So they weren't nearly as engaged as the readers I'm interacting with now, which you should expect, going from a huge, million subscription to a more niche audience.
Great. So, Emily, social media, what's your take on that?
Totally different take. I love Twitter, and I try to engage as much as possible with most people who respond to me on Twitter. I will agree with Amy that email actually is probably the best way to guarantee a response from me, especially if it's some reaction to my work. But I use Twitter probably too frequently, but it's because I'm obsessed with the diverse amount of perspectives I can get from really intelligent people, and especially people who just think totally different from me. I don't tweet storm that much, but I do sometimes. I think I'm important enough. Yeah, but usually, they're like 2 or 3, but it's when it can't fit in the 140 things, in the 140 characters.
And screen grab is for.
Yeah, I love the screen grab. Screen grab is great. But yeah, and I find that it's just, well, also, a lot of it is the medium and how it lets me get away from the New Republic medium, which is, if you ever read the New Republic, it's like everything that I write is what I sort of call a analytical feature. So it's like 2,000 words of analysis and like description, trying to tell a story and then getting into an analysis. And it's just, it's exhausting for me to do all the time. So Twitter is a way where I can get like these, snap analysis and get great ideas and see, reporting from Amy and Hannah, which I rely on so much to do my analysis, and I'm very grateful for. So yeah, I mean, if you ever hate something I wrote, just tell me on Twitter, and maybe I'll retweet it.
And if you're wondering, what they're talking about with a screen grab, what you can do is you can just write something, say in Word or something like that, and you can take a picture, use your computer to do a screen grab of that page that you wrote, and then that becomes like a photo that you attach to your tweet, and it can say a whole lot more than you can say in 140 characters. So that's what they're talking about with a screen grab.
And I only just discovered that, I admit sheepishly, within the last year. But it's changed my life.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Great. Hannah, how about social media?
I use social media. I use Twitter a lot to share a snippet of an interview I've just done. If I just talked to a member of Congress on the Hill and I think they said something really interesting and no one's going to scoop me on it immediately, I'll sometimes share that on Twitter. I find actually I get a lot of engagement with people from the Citizens Climate Lobby when I'm sharing my stories that are like, GOP climate rebels say this. I don't typically respond to tweets, even when I think someone has said something interesting to me, just because I don't like having that dialogue in a public forum. But I do really appreciate emails, our audience being people who are paying a lot to read our stories generally. It's definitely some smart, engaging people who know the topic well that email me. And I do remember one time getting an email from a CCL member who pointed out that in some story I hadn't mentioned, I hadn't specified that it should be a revenue-neutral carbon tax that was being advocated. So I did. I went back and corrected the story and made sure that it said that. But it gave me the impression that we're watched very closely.
Absolutely.
By CCL.
Great, okay. Steve, social media, you engage?
I would love to be more engaged than I am. I love engaging with readers. I do get emails and obviously tweets. I do tend to respond to the emails a little bit more often, just sometimes it's easier to see, and also everything that Amy said about the medium. I wish I could do this all the time, but it would be a full-time job. I, however, am in sort of the position, at least up here, of having a full-time reader feedback mechanism devoted to your voices, which is our letters section. We see, whenever a letter is being considered for publication, a letter regarding one of the pieces that I've written, I see it beforehand, and they say, do you see anything factually wrong with this? And we can tell the letters editor, well, I would maybe look at this report and see if it meshes with this, but and then the editor has the ultimate decision making on whether that letter runs or not, or if it changes or whatever else. But the point is, we see it. The writers see it. We don't get any kind of veto power, but we see it, and that's actually a fairly good mechanism I've found for especially some of the more getting and reviewing some of the more sophisticated feedback that we do get. So it's not like they just go into a pit somewhere. If you've ever written a letter to the editor, we do read every one. The writers don't necessarily, who've written the pieces you're writing about, don't necessarily see every one, but we see all the ones that are being potentially considered. So.
Okay, great. Got a lot of good questions here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw one more question out to the panel, and while they're asking that, I'm going to kind of sift through these and then start asking some questions. So one thing I kind of want to throw out to everybody is, so Sheldon Whitehouse on the connection, he said a lot about that he can pinpoint the day that Republicans just kind of went AWOL on climate change to the date that Citizens United came down, and everybody started clamming up. Is he right? Is this our biggest obstacle, and how do we overcome it? So, Amy, let's start with you.
Well, that's a very big multi-part question with a multi-part answer. I think nothing is ever so simple to have just one cause and one solution. I certainly think the Citizens United was one of the top factors that contributed to the Republican Party turning its back on climate change. I think it began in 2008 with the election of Obama. Anything Obama touched, Republicans didn't like. Then the email issue in the UK in 2009 and 10, where there were some emails that were leaked that made it appear as if climate scientists were trying to hide stuff on the science. I think that fueled a lot of the anti-science movement on climate. And then I think the rise of the Tea Party also fueled the anti-climate policy. Even though the Tea Party groups like to say they don't talk about the science, they do oppose every sort of climate policy. And then factor into that the Citizens United decision. You inject a lot of money into it. And then I think those 3 or 4 factors that I just listed, I think those were the key ingredients to really turn the Republican Party away. I do think the pendulum is swinging back. I think that less today than I did 2 months ago, and certainly less today than I did on November 7th or 8th, 2016. I do think the election of Trump has made it harder and will continue to make it harder for any Republicans who have not yet publicly said they're concerned about climate change. I think it will make it harder for them and less urgent for them to take it up as an issue. I think any sort of action on this issue will come after the 2018 midterm elections, and that's the point at which if there is any movement in this Trump administration, it'll probably be then and probably not from the administration itself, absent legal action pushing them to do some sort of watered-down carbon regulation.